Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you, of course, Nigar, for joining us. Nigar Goksel is our main speaker today, and she is the Turkey director for the International Crisis Group. And the topic of the webinar today is prospects and risks in Turkey-Armenia relations. So we have a bit of a technical crisis right now, which is our moderator. Those of you who joined probably noticed our moderator, Sevil Husseinova, had internet problems, which means we will alter the format somewhat and proceed without the moderator, which means Nigar and I will have a direct dialogue for the first 30-40 minutes of the webinar, followed by the question and answer session. Now, if you'd like to post a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and post the question. Our colleagues will collect them and then pass them to us to answer. And we also have a chat window open, so which is public. So if you would like to post a comment rather than a question, please click on the chat window and post it there. Again, keep in mind it's open to the other members of the audience as well as to the speakers. So I would appreciate it if you are polite and professional in your comments. Not to take more time, let's get directly to it. In the past few weeks, we all witnessed a number of messages exchanged between the leaders of Turkey and Armenia, which suggests that we are entering another round of attempts to normalize the relationship between the two countries. And because this is not the first, of course, attempt, we had a number of them in the past and all of them failed. The first question that comes to mind is, how is the current situation different? And if the current context provides more opportunities for actually moving successfully towards the normalization. And what's discussed the most, and perhaps the most obvious difference, is that in 2009, when the attempts to normalize failed, Turkey conditioned the normalization of its relations with Armenia with the progress in Nagorno-Karabakh talks, which in effect meant the withdrawal of Armenian armed forces from at least some of the regions surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, unfortunately, we did not have any progress in the negotiations on Nagorno-Karabakh. We had instead a war in the end of 2020, and as a result of the war, essentially that precondition is to a degree obsolete because there are no armed forces of Armenia in any of the surrounding regions of Azerbaijan, of Nagorno-Karabakh. And also considering that the messages started coming first from what I noticed, at least from Turkey, so presumably at least that condition isn't necessarily present anymore. But there are also other differences that I notice, which some of them are positive, such as the communication this time is initiated directly by the parties, because all the previous attempts were initiated by third parties. This time the conversations seem to be direct, which might indicate more genuine interest towards normalization compared to the past. A second big difference and related I see is that everything is in public. So all the communication is happening publicly, which is again in stark difference with the past, where all the attempts to normalize were preceded by pretty long secret negotiations between the parties. And while some might argue in favor of secret negotiations, considering all the attempts have failed, there can be an argument made that perhaps because publics were not aware or for some other reason that wasn't successful, so perhaps this public attempt, a fully transparent one, might have a different result. But then there is a flip side to this kind of positive developments, which is in part why everything is so public, is because there is no direct relationship or communication between Armenia and Turkey, or Yerevan and Ankara. And that is quite unprecedented. So in the previous 30 years, all the previous Armenian administrations had a rather direct contact with Turkey. All the previous presidents, Petrosyan, Koçaryan, Sarkisyan, all met their counterparts. And apart from that, there were always more mid-level contacts between the two parties. This is a quite unique situation that, to the best of my knowledge, there is absolutely no direct contact between the sides. And that opens the door for some problems, starting from potentially a possibility of misinterpreting each other's public messages without a chance to ask directly, what do you mean, and get a clarification. To simply an impossibility of taking this public conversation to the next level in form of negotiating diplomatic relations or opening of the border or anything else. Any of that would require, of course, a direct official contact. So these are a number of differences I see compared to 2009. And again, some of them, I think the public part and the direct initiation I see as positive, but I also see some serious downsides. How do you see, Nigar, the situation, and what are the differences in your view, and what are the prospects?
Thanks a lot, Phil. I mean, obviously, I can only talk about the Turkey angle, and I also don't represent Ankara, so there are two significant disclaimers. I mean, for two reasons, I thought that this time it would be much simpler. And to some degree, my two thoughts are still valid, but less than I had thought they would be. So my first thought was about Karabakh. As you said, in 2009, Turkey had expected a concrete step from Armenia regarding Nagorno-Karabakh, the regions outside of it, adjacent to it. But since Azerbaijan took back those adjacent regions by war last year, and having heard Aliyev in April say that it could be useful for Turkey and Armenia to normalize relations, I had sort of automatically thought that that obstacle is lifted. A second thing that I thought would be easier is about genocide recognition, because in 2009, I recollect that among some Armenians, many Armenians, let's say, there was a suspicion that Turkey was trying to stall genocide recognitions via its attempt to normalize with Armenia. So telling Washington, D.C., perhaps, that the US president recognizing genocide would disrupt the positive momentum between the two countries, or pointing to the Prospective History Commission as an alternative. Now, after Biden's use of the word genocide, I sort of assumed that the suspicion of Turkey's intentions would go away. So these were two reasons that I thought this would be, these are clear skies. What can prevent them from normalizing? But I've come to realize it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I'll say four things about sort of both the sort of aftermath of 2009, or the tastes after taste of 2009, and also developments that have happened since then. One is that Azerbaijan and Turkey have become much closer. In many ways, they've closed ranks. And to the extent that in 2009, Baku felt bypassed and there was mistrust about what Ankara was doing, and supposedly Russia was poised to take advantage of the souring of relations between Ankara and Baku, I think there's a very strong sense in Ankara that this should not be repeated. So that I think they're very geared at not going behind Baku's back, or letting any third party, and any third party can mean Armenia, it can mean Russia, it can mean Turkish nationalists, try to drive a wedge between Ankara and Baku. So that's one. Secondly, I think domestic dynamics have changed, and I won't comment on whether that's positive or negative in terms of this process, because I think it can go different ways. The President Erdogan has consolidated power even more since 2009, and the traditional nationalists, the so-called ultra-nationalists, are now very much empowered in both the state and the government. Now, this can be not bad if you consider that the President Erdogan has expressed himself a strong political will or apolitical will for normalization. And it also can mean that these nationalists will not try to score political points by trying to undermine this process. So you can look at it positively. And of course, you also have to remember that the nationalists in the opposition are also vying for nationalist votes. The political parties in the opposition. So it's a different sort of political configuration. But I think there's also two other elements of the domestic scene that's changed. One is that foreign policy making in general has become a little more disjointed. And I see this, I don't work directly on this issue in crisis groups, so I see it in other conflicts more. But you see a disconnected Turkey between the security bureaucracy sometimes, the foreign ministry, and different names within the presidency, different advisors. So it can be it can seem a little disconnected. And I'm saying this with regard to other conflicts. And secondly, liberals and civil society that used to form some kind of a bridge between the communities are very weak. And the other civil society is both disengaged and uninformed, I would say, about Turkey and Armenia. So it's really hard for me to foresee how public debate in Turkey will be shaped. And I don't know whether it matters that much. I think public debate might matter more in Armenia. Thirdly, I think Turkey-West relations have gotten worse. Turkey-Russia relations have changed, and Russia-West relations have gotten worse. Turkey and Russia have dealt with each other in other theaters more in the last 12 years, 11 years. And in some fronts that are more existential for Turkey, Russia has leverage. I think Turkey is going to be very, very motivated or sensitive about not inviting Russian pushback into any initiative it takes in the Caucasus. And I think this to keep in mind. And fourthly, finally, I think different from 2009, Ankara foresees things happening slowly, sort of step by step, as opposed to culminating in one big ceremony. So steps building gradually and ensuring that potential spoilers aren't irritated. And I can see that that can raise trust problems and also wear on patience, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Nigar. And towards the end, you started interrupting, so you are aware. Initially, it was all good, but now you froze on my screen. Not sure if you can do something about that. Thank you very much for this introduction. I guess you already transitioned talking about the prospects and risks, the main topic essentially of the webinar, and thinking why would the two governments be interested in either doing this and proceeding or not, and whether it can be step-by-step process or kind of one big package as they attempted to do in 2009. So for the benefits, this from the Armenian side, I see many. There is one that's most talked about, of course, is the economic benefits for Armenia in opening the roads to Turkey. But there is much more, of course, to the economic benefits than that. The opening of the roads with Turkey is not only opening with Turkey, but it's also a road to Mediterranean and through that to the rest of the world. Similarly, the mirror image for Turkey is not only a road to Armenia, it's a road towards Central Asia and other regions. So there is clear economic rationale for both governments to proceed here, and that is well known. But there is also, at least the Armenian side, I'd say, political benefit, which is opening of the roads and opening up and reinvigorating its relationships with the West and the East through the new roads, new trades. It's also means diversifying its foreign policy and becoming much more integrated into world structures. And that's hard to underestimate. And then there is less tangible benefit of trust building between Turkish and Armenian societies, which have been effectively isolated from each other for 100 years and following, of course, a very violent history. And even we saw that the opening of limited air travel in early 2000s, how much it impacted the relationship and especially the image of Turks in Armenia. For me, it was very visible, where from some unknown, right, scary kind of enemy, it became a much more familiar, regular person who at least some Armenians have seen in their streets or travel to Turkey. But that was very limited, of course, number of people who could use air travel or the land road through Georgia. So opening a border, it will create much more essential day-by-day communication, which can help with trust building. So I see a number of benefits here, but there are also, of course, a number of risks. It's not an accident that these attempts to normalize are not there constantly. They come every 10 to 15 years. And the early ones, right, so we're in early 90s, where after Armenia became first independent, so that, of course, stopped during Karabakh War and when Turkey essentially supported Azerbaijan and closed the border with Armenia. In 2000s, more close attempts resulted in some progress, such as opening of the air travel, as I mentioned, but didn't go as far as normalization or opening of borders or diplomatic relations. The most visible attempt was 2009, Zurich Protocols, which also failed. And we have the current one, again, every 10, 15 years, they all follow, in a way, an incoming government, at least on the Armenian side, and this short-lived political space and opening, which is where I have a question whether a longer dragged out process is possible politically. Because again, what I see is that Pashinyan government recently won a second election following a loss in a war, which in a way indicates a popular mandate to try to normalize. And yet, one thing all these previous attempts had in common, apart from failing, is that the political opening was very short-lived. By definition, because the normalization with Turkey and vice versa, I'm sure, is not a politically popular phenomenon. So even though third parties might see it as beneficial for Armenia, it's not necessarily perceived as such by the population. And it's a hard sell for any government to actually promote the normalization with Turkey, trying to convince the population that it's a reliable actor you can work with. So here I see that this window might close, at least politically, for the Armenian leadership. And it can close with the first crisis, which can be internal, such as economic, but it can also be external, such as a rhetoric coming from Turkey. And you mentioned that earlier in your talk that you thought first that it will be easy, because essentially the Karabakh question isn't the same as it used to be, right? And Turkey can potentially move easier, but then it's changing. And at least according to my observation, it has been changing, as in the initial messaging, and the current one has been shifting. So the current message coming from Ankara messages in the last few days seem to be harsher or have more preconditions there. And that is, at least it's presented as such in Armenian media. And here I see again a possibility that, well, first of all, the position might harden on both sides, but also the messaging themselves can be interpreted or misinterpreted. So I want to turn here to the messaging now coming from the two sides, and what is it that they are trying to say publicly? Because on the surface, yes, they are talking, so there is a positive impetus, and yet what they are saying isn't all that clear, frankly. So let me start from the Armenian one and then ask you about the Turkish side. The Armenian side is saying, at least overtly, what they have been saying all along. So normalization with Turkey without preconditions. This is the exact same language used by the, prior to that, by Sarkisyan administration and so on. So there is a continuity in language. But no precondition in a way is a condition on its own. So I want to open up a bit the parenthesis here. From what I understand, no precondition means a couple of things. From the Armenian side, that means that the Armenian government does not tie in normalization with Turkey with the recognition of the Armenian genocide by Turkey. Now that might seem obvious from the Turkish end, is not so obvious from the Armenian end, where both in Armenia and in diaspora, there is a great expectation to make this safe and have trust in Turkey. Turkey first needs to come to terms with the genocide. So again, proceeding with normalization and putting that aside is quite a big deal for any Armenian leadership. So this is kind of what Armenia offers in a way. On the flip side, no precondition from Turkish end effectively means not tying in the Turkey-Armenian normalization with Armenia-Azerbaijan process, which is on a much harder track. Essentially, despite the war, the enmity persists. There is no visible prospect for normalization anytime soon. So no preconditions from Turkey in a most direct sense means not tying in the relationship with Armenia, with Armenia-Azerbaijan normalization. So this is what I see from the Armenian side. I think it should be, at least the parenthesis should be open so we know what we are dealing with. And yeah, I'm quite confused about what I'm hearing from Turkey because A, there is an attempt to normalize, but two, there are a number of messages that seem to be preconditions, such as mention of territorial integrity by President Erdogan, which potentially is not only territorial integrity of Turkey and Armenia, but also of Azerbaijan. There is talk of Armenia not occupying lands by the foreign minister, which isn't absolutely clear to me which lands is Armenia occupying and so on, right? So what is the Turkish position right now? Your thoughts?
I think it's really good that you underlined the sort of sense of like the time sensitivity from an Armenian perspective. I think that's something that can be lost to us sometimes here sitting in Turkey. And I have thought about this issue of messaging a lot. I can't say I've come to a very clear answer, but I'll tell you sort of where I've arrived. I think to start off on a positive message, I think one message that's lost is that Turkey seems to be trying to really underline that they respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the Republic of Armenia. That sort of seems to be, don't worry, that's like something that's a given. That message, you know, might be sort of between the lines, might not be catching enough attention. But I think it's also, I mean, I think I can also see in the messaging that Turkey is going to advocate for Azerbaijan's territorial integrity as well, while it wants to normalize with Armenia, and in a way not see these as mutually exclusive, perhaps. I don't think it's a precondition, or at least I don't think the word precondition or a concrete definition of a condition is there. Not to say it won't be, but I don't think it's there right now. I think the message is rather that normalization can't drive a wedge between Turkey and Azerbaijan. And this message may not be, and I don't think it is necessarily all, directed to Yerevan, but also to Baku, to Moscow, to domestic constituencies, nationalists inside the government or outside the government. And I may be reading into this too much, but there are reasons for me to think like this on a number of fronts. I think the crafting of that wording is really an expression of the intent not to whet the appetite of people. Let's say, I'm just giving examples. Could be Russians who in 2009 saw an opportunity to capitalize on Turkey-Azerbaijan relations souring. It could be domestic groups in Turkey who saw that opportunity, the opportunity of Azerbaijan getting angry and Turkey sort of scrambling to win them back as an opportunity to weaken Erdogan. So just like 2009 left some scars for Armenia, I think it left some scars for the Ankara leadership as well. And I think that the messaging there is, we want to normalize with Armenia, but no one can or should see this as an opportunity to weaken Turkey in the region or to weaken the Turkish government domestically. I'm not saying I think this is, I'm just saying what I read into it. And I think upon that, you know, saying, don't see this as an opportunity to attack us in any way, to some actors, not necessarily Yerevan, could be also Yerevan, but not necessarily. And also adding onto that, like plugging onto that, a positive prospect. Why don't we focus on regional integration? That's in the interest of Armenia and Turkey. And it's also something we can sell to all the others that might otherwise try to drive a wedge between, I mean, try to undermine this effort. So I think it's this understanding that either Baku, Turkey and Armenia can try to normalize, but either Baku or Russia can undermine this at any minute. Therefore, we have to have them on board. And so to have them on board, let's focus on things that we all gain from. And thus the regional framework, thus the transport, not just that. I think that's also Turkey's soft power and it's Turkey's edge. It's what Turkey's good at in the region. So it's not only to appease other actors, but things converge, different reasons converge that would explain why this focus on transport and trade and region and having Iran and Russia all come together. And I think Ankara would like the West to be on board, but they would also need to see that it's in their long-term interest, even if it doesn't look like it's in their immediate interest, because it's a very regional initiative. And I think this has to do with the scars of 2009 that really cut to the heart of the Turkish government. You had the nationalists attacking, saying, you're selling out Azerbaijan. And this is a very sensitive time in Ankara when you think about it. Poles, nationalists vying for power from the current government. And I think just like Ankara needs to see the scars of 2009 from Armenia, there's also the opposite side of the story.
Thank you, Nigar. And to the audience, I do see some people raising hands. So we do not have an option of bringing you into the conversation directly. There's also a lot of people in the chat, so it will be too crowded. So if possible, could you please write your comment or question either in the Q&A or chat button, clicking one of these, and then we will read and try to answer them. Thank you for that. Thank you, Nigar. If I can so summarize, or from what I heard, a few points were that, well, first, the messaging isn't only directed to each other. Perhaps the other side is somewhere in the bottom of the list of the recipients of the message, although the normalization interest is with each other, but each side also has to take into consideration Azerbaijan, Turkey, Russia, domestic audiences, West, and everybody else, and kind of writing every message and pronouncing it. So all of that is taken into consideration. So while reading it, we should read it in that context. The second important point I think you raised was that, so in 2009, was quite consequential in a number of ways. One of them being that the interests of other actors weren't necessarily fully taken into consideration early enough, and in the long run proved to be detrimental. So to a degree that should be considered now in the earlier stages, while at least considered and analyzed, and not assume that the third parties don't exist. While of course thinking also, what are the benefits of Turkey-Armenia normalization, and whether or not for each side it's worth proceeding essentially with this process, considering potential reaction of other actors, or how to bring them on board. And here you mentioned that this regional format, where it is considered more part of a regional integration opening process as opposed to bilateral, might be the way forward. At least this is what some key points I heard. Could correct me later if I'm wrong. So this brings me to a place where I think we should maybe try to put some final touches on this conversation and see what questions are coming up. So from my point of view, there are a few things that are critical here. One is that the 2009 scars are serious, as in there was a very serious attempt made in 2009. A lot of political capital was invested into that, and that the very public and ground failure in a way puts a lot of pause for both sides of how to proceed with this. So that should be considered, and perhaps should be made more explicit than it currently is. The second point is that again, interest of third parties should be considered, and hopefully yet to a limit, because there is of course bilateral relationship at stake, and yet how to make it at least acceptable, if not beneficial, for the involved neighbors and further down global actors. And to do all of that, I think an immediate step needs to be some form of a direct contact, because in absence of that, it seems simply impossible to proceed anywhere past some rhetorical exercise happening on media that we are seeing currently. And that can be as minimalistic as simply a contact, as in an appointed person that talks to, have a person to call to, or meet and talk, and as extensive as diplomatic relations that, however, precede this ground bargain which the sides tried to pull in 2009. It's essentially potentially something relatively easy, such as establishing diplomatic relations, can precede the ironing out of all the thorny details, such as the modalities of road opening and any kind of trade agreement and everything else. That's essentially, you can't have diplomatic relations even with an enemy while everything else is being discussed exactly through that channel. So I see that as a potential necessary step if there is to be any kind of a progress that goes beyond the rhetoric, while being aware that there are numerous obstacles to normalization. Any thoughts from you?
I mean, I totally agree. I've been working on Turkey, and I've been working on Cyprus recently, and I see how Turkey and Greece have extremely deep disagreements about history, about Cyprus. I mean, totally. But that doesn't mean you can't talk and you can't have a direct diplomatic contacts. And in fact, I think if you can have direct contact, and then you can argue about your differences. You can build regional platforms upon that. You don't have to have a regional platform before you talk. You can start talking and then build it. I totally agree with you on that. I also think we have to be very careful, all sides have to be very careful about how triggerable this issue is, and that, Turkish constituencies can be very triggered by land claims or genocide recognition issues or anti-Turkey campaigns, and likewise Armenian constituencies can be very triggered by talking about Karabakh or whatnot. And whereas we have to expect that these are going to happen. You're going to have voices from both sides that say things that you don't agree with, and this isn't a reason to derail a process of diplomatic engagement. I think you do your diplomatic engagement because of your shared interests, not because you agree on everything. I think also the Western engagement is also important, but it also has to be a little bit more realistic, and that there is a reality that Russia has an upper hand in the region now, and it has leverage over Turkey and Armenia in different ways. And I think if the West doesn't have the West is a general statement, but sort of the political will to counterbalance Russia overall, you kind of have to accept to be in a supportive role. And that might be difficult to swallow, but it might be what's necessary now. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And turning to the questions, there are a few that seem to be somewhat similar in a sense, talking about the genocide recognition question, and that to summarize, the question will be: is it possible to proceed with any form of normalization, essentially without having the genocide recognition expressly on the table? And for a number of reasons, the first being a quite potentially real threat, or perceived threat at least, that we have in Armenia from the side of the Turkish government. That particularly given the recent war and Turkish much more direct involvement in it compared to anything we've seen in the recent past. So that's only kind of strengthens this point that Turkey is actually not a neutral nation, but an enemy. And to Armenia, and without in some form proceeding with the recognition of the genocide and acknowledgement of this from the Turkish end, the threat is ever present, and then the normalization or opening of the borders rather, might only heighten this threat. But let me start myself, I guess, from commenting on that, but then I would want to hear your opinion. First of all, yes, I do fully agree and sympathize with the comment. I don't think Turkey is a neutral actor for Armenia. It has clearly not been in the 30 years. Perhaps it was more neutral in early 90s, and as time went by, it became increasingly less neutral and much more hostile, especially in the past year or so, both in terms of rhetoric, but also very direct military engagement and support for Azerbaijan. And that's absolutely not to be dismissed. I do see in the current situation, at least, Turkey and Armenia as not being any at all positive neighbors, but rather adversaries and possibly even enemies. This is where the question for me personally is what's better than to continue with closed borders and absence of diplomatic relations, or an attempt to normalize and establish diplomatic relations. And perhaps as someone from a counter-resolution background, the answer is very clearly, for me, the second, is that enmity doesn't preclude the establishment of diplomatic relations, but to the contrary, you absolutely need to have direct relationship, you need to have direct contact. Again, throughout history, countries and nations had wars, and yet they also had direct communication, which allowed at some point then to negotiate an end to war, but also to sort out day-by-day problems. So the war doesn't need to be global, right? So even if you are in a conflict, you can potentially sort some day-by-day issues, which can help your populations quite a bit. And even into early 90s, right, when we had the first Karabakh war, we had direct communication between the Armenian and Azerbaijani leadership, and despite a very destructive war, We know a lot that how specific issues were solved, and in a lot of cases, such as prisoner exchange, and what else. So I see a big benefit in direct contact, but that can in turn help prevent a lot of misunderstanding, can help negotiate a lot of problems before they escalate towards a physical confrontation. And in absence of it, essentially the military talk is much more likely. So again, at the very least, as a measure of safety, or at least a step towards one, I see a big benefit in having a direct contact, and no benefit whatsoever in absence of it, which is where the third parties can absolutely take advantage of absence of direct negotiation. So even absolutely minimalistically, to look from the safety, I see a need in direct contact. But in a bigger picture, direct contact can also help actually normalize relations, build trust, as I mentioned before. There's a lot of theories about economic interdependence and economic linkages making direct confrontation much far less likely, and even if you have a confrontation between, say, Greece and Turkey right now, right, being within one alliance, clearly is mitigated. So their relationship, existence of relationship mitigates it escalating into a military conflict. So precisely because the relationship is problematic, I see a lot of need for establishment of direct relations that can mitigate further fallout. Nigar, any comments on?
I mean, I agree with you. I think not knowing each other at all must be the driving sort of the force behind this fear. It's hard for me to relate to it because sitting here, I don't see a prospect that Turkey would invade Armenia. That's, you know, but I respect different views about that, and you know, sort of how the collective memories have a effect on today. I think sort of the support to Azerbaijan with regard to the territories outside of Karabakh, you know, that in the Turkish mindset, that's very different from. It's almost like a correction, and it's hard for me to explain that without sounding like I'm justifying it. But you know, once I was talking to some Azeris, and they said in 1991 or 2, I can't remember, you know, we asked Turkey for helicopters. They couldn't even send us helicopters to help us from leaving our land. So it's a sort of that was like I don't know, it was like we failed our ally back then, and so it's seen in a different breath as opposed to you know, let's anyway, I don't. That's hard for me to address in a short answer, but I think I agree with your answer, Phil, and I think having relations is the only way that that one can actually overcome and deal with these different perceptions.
There are direct questions to you connected to Turkey. So one is. One is a continuation of this one, so let's get to it. And I think you alluded to this, but perhaps you can restate the point or clarify the point. The question is the messaging about territorial integrity and so on, in part, also an attempt from Turkey to message to Armenia that there is no interest to invade Armenia or in any other form threaten the Armenian state or Armenian society?
I definitely, yes. I mean, I think it's all three, and it was sort of encapsulated in one point, in that, you know, Azerbaijan, don't worry, we respect your, you know, we care about your territorial integrity. Armenia, don't worry, we care about your, and we totally respect it, and you know, we'll expect the same in terms of our territorial integrity. So I think it was a three-way message that was all condensed into one, but I think all three were equally important.
I mean, another question again connected to Turkey directly is that can we see this as an attempt to improve its image globally in regard to the West, but also potentially in building better relationship with Russia? Essentially, how much is this global image of Turkey important in its current attempt to normalize?
You know, I've thought about that. I don't think it's very central. I think it's overestimated, and that I think Turkey's global image depends on many other things much more than whether it normalizes relations with Armenia. And this has to do with its clashes of interests, and also values with other countries. I mean, that I could count 10 different determinants of Turkey's image in the world that would be more central than normalizing with Armenia right now. I think it's overestimated. I don't think the prestige that Turkey gains from that front I don't think it's the driving force.
Yeah, no, I would in fact agree. I think the situation in 90s, it was even 2000s was very different, where essentially the global institutions and meant much more and had much more political power, and were really integrating with the international community, proving your credentials as a country that respects human rights and is benevolent towards neighbors and so on, was a really big incentive. EU norm accession process, of course, for Turkey was important. So I think all of that is somewhat becoming secondary for everybody, and local bilateral relations seem to be much more important now, in absence overall a retreat of this liberal world order.
I mean, and frankly, domestically as well. I mean, right now, I don't see any effort by the president to try to win back liberal constituencies, and that would tip any of his balances domestically. In fact, quite the contrary. I think it's nationalist constituencies that he needs on board to win, to get ahead in the polls. So, I mean, even domestically, which is the same groups, the sort of the liberal democratic groups in Turkey that are connected to the Westerners, yeah, I don't see them as being a determinant, a decisive factor in this calculus.
Oh, another question connected to domestic politics is about Armenia. So let me take that on. The question is that we have quite extreme polarization within Armenia, quite unprecedented again, I would say, in this past 30 years, especially after the war. How can that play into any attempt by the Armenian leadership to normalize? Certainly a very valid question and an important point. It will not be easy, as we saw also prior to the war. Essentially very strong public, well, let's say oppositional, but then also public support, let's say, for continuation of a conflict with Azerbaijan, not compromising with Azerbaijan, did drive or at least helped drive the current government towards a very non-compromising position, perhaps much more non-compromising than the previous governments had. So that public pressure, especially coming from the opposition, is still, of course, present. Where I see an opening, and why also publicly we see the Pashinyan, Prime Minister Pashinyan and his party making very public overtures toward Turkey and talking about normalization, is, I believe, a very short time opening where they won election in a way campaigning, either overtly or implicitly, campaigning on normalization. So there is right now, again, short-term public support, or at least public legitimacy given to this government to attempt to normalize. However, of course, if the normalization is either beneficial or at least acceptable to the Armenian side. So it's not a blank check of normalizing at any cost, right? So it's a normalize if it's can be seen as beneficial for Armenia, as improving Armenian safety, as opposed to compromising it. So this is where the rhetoric becomes important, and the way that what Turkish leadership is saying and what are actual preconditions it's putting forward is extremely important in deciding whether or not the Armenian government is able to proceed with the normalization, or should be even incentivized to proceed with normalization or not, because there is a line after which it becomes simply more dangerous and not beneficial, both politically, internally, but also in terms of the security of the Armenian.
I think that's really an important point, Phil. And I'm not sure I'd call it preconditions, because that is, that would sort of require a spell out. But the things that Turkey is thinking about managing delicately and slowly and with fragility, versus the imperative that this actually happen sooner rather than later, I think is a very important divergence to recognize and maybe act upon.
And we have a question on Russia. So the question is, how does Turkey-Russia relations impact the Turkey-Armenia relations? So from my end, I don't have much to add here. As in publicly, we all saw that the Foreign Minister Lavrov and overall the Foreign Ministry came out and publicly supporting the normalization. They spoke about the important role Russia played in trying to help the normalization in 2009 as well. So far, again, what's visible, it's a lot of public messaging from Turkey, Armenia, and also from Russia, all being in support. So and that might be another reason why this lasts a while. There seems to be geopolitical opening for that, at least in public realm. And that might be this might be a space potentially to proceed with all kind of regional opening of roads and establishment of diplomatic relations. I'm personally not ready to comment on in a more nuanced way here, because it probably requires much longer analysis, which you might have to do at some point, inviting also Russian experts to this conversation. But Nigar, any thoughts from you about?
I was just, for the first time I started looking at the questions and I got a little distracted, but I think I mean, again, I'm not speaking about what I wish was true or what I think should be true. But I think there's a recognition in Ankara that nothing's going to proceed against Russia's will. And so if a normalization requires Russia to you know, have a sense of control or a sense of ownership, then that's what it has to be. Again, I think this is just an acceptance of reality.
Of course, agreed. And the last question I see is about the Armenian community in Turkey, and that has been so far only instrumentalized and used as a rhetorical tool without necessarily being seen as an actor on its own or given any space or voice in this process. And I guess there is no question as such, it's more of a comment, I would say, but a question can be how this community could potentially help or be a voice. But if I can also expand the question, I guess it goes back to something you mentioned, that this is also quite unprecedented time when civil societies have very minimal role. All the previous attempts had a very active engagement of civil society, which even when the official process did not result in any breakthrough, there was a lot of breakthroughs on civil society level in terms of conversation about even Armenian genocide in Turkey, about Turkish image in Armenia, and so on. So there was a big input. From my end, I do see this as quite a serious challenge, and probably one that is not going to go away, because globally the role of civil society has weakened. Again, when we were all moving in the direction of liberal democracy, the civil societies had a very major role to play. Currently, we are back to much more state to state. The role of states essentially grew with this role of civil society. Seem to be decreasing, at least in international politics. It doesn't mean there is no role, but it seems to be much more of a humanitarian kind of supporting particular, essentially humanitarian issues, as opposed to trying to set a global agenda. Perhaps the role of analysis at the same time can grow. So if we can look into civil society, not only as NGOs, but also as an analyst, I think that can be important, because again, this misinterpretation becomes a potential challenge to normalization. So at least spelling things out that diplomats and officials cannot necessarily say bluntly, that can be one space where civil society can play, I see. And that's where potentially the Turkish Armenians can also have a role, because they understand in a way that the Turkish society, whether being, of course, Turkish citizens, and they might not understand Armenia as well, but when they articulate what the Turkish side needs and interests, that might be more acceptable and more trusted, let's say, by the Armenian public than something coming from a Turkish official or a Turkish analyst. That's one potential role I see.
I totally agree with you. I think the Armenian community is very important. I really haven't been looking carefully, but I haven't seen that there's been a very strong position taken or like a debate within the, like in Agos or whatnot. I haven't looked very carefully, but I haven't seen it. And like you said, I agree. This seems like it's going to be for now a more state to state a conversation. Maybe we need to all think about what kind of a role people that are not in the state can play, but I don't have an answer to that. And I think civil society is very important. I come from civil society, but I don't see in the near term that they're going to really shift public debate.
Thank you, Nigar. And I guess let's go towards the close, and a couple of points to restate. So one is that I think we both agreed that direct link is important if this is to go to any next stage and not stay on the rhetorical level. Same time, taking into consideration all the regional dynamics and relations of both Turkey with Armenia, Azerbaijan, Russia, and others, and Armenia of Russia with Russia and others is extremely important. And that there are many problems that might very well undermine this process, and the chance for failure is probably much bigger than the chance for success. But given that previous point about the importance of other actors in the region, I'd invite you at some point, perhaps a few months down the road, assuming this process continues, to come back here and with presence of also colleagues from Russia and Azerbaijan, two actors that seem to be extremely important in this conversation, that we can discuss this process from, again, this more regional perspective, taking into consideration also the Russian and Azerbaijani position. So once again, thank you, Nigar, for joining us. Thank you.
Great to join you. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Bye. And until the next webinar.